There is a version of you that makes decisions before you do. It moves first. It feels something in a room before you've had time to think about it. It pulls you toward certain people and away from others. It keeps returning you to the same arguments, the same patterns, the same quiet fears. And most of the time, you have no idea why. You experience the result, but not the source. This is not mysticism. This is not philosophy for its own sake. This is something far more uncomfortable. The possibility that most of what drives you is happening somewhere you cannot see. That the part of your mind you call yourself, the part that wakes up in the morning, that plans, that reasons, that decides, is only the surface of something far deeper. Think about the last time you reacted to something more strongly than the situation seemed to deserve. A small comment that felt like an attack. A stranger who immediately reminded you of someone. A dream that stayed with you for days and you couldn't explain why. Something moved in you, but you didn't choose for it to move. What was that? For most of human history, people answered that question with gods and demons, with fate, with supernatural forces working through the body. And then, in the late 19th century, science stepped in and said, no, this is the brain, neurons, chemistry, cause and effect at the level of cells. But there was a problem with that answer, not because it was wrong, but because it was incomplete. Because it could tell you what was happening, but not what it meant. Because it mapped the structure without ever touching the feeling of being inside it. And that gap between what the brain does and what it means to be the person living in that brain. That gap is where one man spent his entire life. His name was Carl Gustav Jung. He was a Swiss psychiatrist, a scholar of mythology and religion, a student of human symbol and dream. He was, depending on who you ask, a visionary or a mystic, a genius or a fraud. He was difficult to categorize, impossible to summarize, and deeply, stubbornly serious about one central question. What is the mind, really? Not in the clinical sense, not as a mechanism, but as something experienced, as something that shapes identity, meaning, love, fear. The stories you tell about your life, the parts of yourself you cannot stand to look at, the symbols that appear in dreams you never asked for. He believed the mind was not a problem to be solved. It was a world to be explored, and not just your world, something older, something shared, something that ran through all of human history in the form of stories and symbols that kept appearing, across cultures that had never met, in dreams that followed patterns no individual could have invented on their own. He spent decades walking into that world, not with certainty, not with a fixed map, with curiosity and patience and, at times, genuine terror. And what he found there changed the way a great many people understand themselves. Carl Jung did not study the mind you know. He studied the part of you that remains hidden. If this kind of exploration, calm, deep, unhurried, is what you come here for, consider subscribing. There's more like this. He grew up surrounded by the dead. Not literally, though in a sense even that is true. His father was a pastor in a small Swiss village. The churchyard was nearby. His earliest memories were of sermons about sin, of prayers for grace, of the adult world organized entirely around the idea that the most important things in life were invisible. That meaning was not in the body, but beyond it, that the soul was always in question. You might expect that kind of upbringing to produce either a devout believer or a firm atheist. Carl Jung became neither. He became something harder to name, someone who took the invisible world seriously but could never accept the church's explanation for it. He was born on July 26, 1875, in Kesswil, a small town on Lake Constance in Switzerland. The family moved while he was still young, settling eventually in Klein-Hüningen, near Basel. His father, Paul Achilles Jung, was a well-meaning but deeply troubled man. A man of faith who, as Jung would later understand, had quietly stopped believing. The religion he preached had become a kind of cage he could not leave and could not live inside. He went through the rituals. He delivered the words. But the confidence was gone. Karl watched this. He was an observant child, solitary much of the time, more comfortable with his own thoughts than with other children. He noticed what adults said and what they seemed to actually feel, and noticed, even at a young age, that these were not always the same thing. His mother was a stranger kind of figure. Elise Jung had what her son would later describe as two personalities. During the day she was warm, conventional, competent, a proper pastor's wife. But at night she sometimes spoke in ways that unsettled the household. Her voice would change. She would say things that felt like they came from somewhere else. Jung didn't know what to do with this. He filed it away. It became one of many pieces of evidence he would spend his life trying to understand. The outer world of his childhood was small. The inner world was enormous. He had dreams that struck him as important in a way he couldn't explain. One in particular, a dream he had around the age of 3 or 4, stayed with him for decades. He would only write about it publicly in his old age, in his autobiography. He dreamed of a large underground chamber, a ritual object, a presence both sacred and terrifying. He woke from it disturbed and fascinated. He didn't understand it then. He returned to it throughout his life as evidence of something, that the unconscious does not speak in ordinary language, that even a child's sleeping mind can contain something vast and ancient. At school, he was not extraordinary in the conventional sense. He was intelligent, but not especially motivated by the things school rewarded. What consumed him was the life happening inside. The questions no one seemed to be asking, the contradictions no one seemed to notice. There was, around the age of 12, an incident. He was pushed by another boy, shoved to the ground, hit his head on the pavement. He lay there dazed and had a thought that alarmed him. If I faint, I won't have to go to school for a while. The thought was followed by a decision, or something like a decision. He began to faint at school, to have episodes that kept him home, that freed him from the ordinary obligations. It went on for months. He listened to his parents worry about him, heard his father praying in another room, and then one afternoon overheard someone mention that if it continued, he might not be able to have a career or a future. He got up. He went to his father's study, found a Latin textbook, and began to work. The fainting stopped. He never had another episode. He was 12 years old, and he had already encountered something that would become a lifelong theme: the power of what lives beneath conscious intention. He had, without planning it, used the unconscious for escape. And once he saw what he'd done, once he became conscious of the mechanism lost its hold. This pattern, awareness as a form of liberation, would become the core of almost everything he ever thought. There was another part of his childhood identity that became increasingly important. He began to feel, clearly and persistently, that he was somehow two people, not in a dramatic or pathological sense, but there was the child who went to school, who lived in the house by the church, who was the pastor's son, and there was something else, an older presence, something that felt less like a child and more like a very old man watching the world with calm patience. He would later call these his number 1 and number 2 personalities. Number 1 lived in time, in the ordinary world of obligations and relationships and growing up. Number 2 lived outside time, in something older, something that made the particular details of any given life feel small by comparison. He never stopped feeling both. That division, between the person you present to the world and the deeper, stranger, older self that observes from somewhere within, would become the foundation of the idea he spent a lifetime developing. By the time Jung arrived at the University of Basel in the early 1890s, he had already spent years in conversation with questions that most people around him weren't asking. He came from a modest background. His family's financial situation was not comfortable, and there were moments when it wasn't certain he would be able to study at all. But he found his way. And once at university, he was exposed to ideas that began to give shape to things he'd felt but never had words for. He studied natural science first, not because it was where his heart was, but because it was serious. It was the dominant mode of inquiry in his era. The 19th century had arrived at science as the most reliable path to truth, and there was something in Jung that wanted to be rigorous, wanted to test ideas against reality rather than simply reflect on them. He had respect for evidence. He had no patience for vague mysticism unchecked by observation. But natural science, as he encountered it, had a problem. It was magnificent at describing what things were made of. It was much weaker on the question of what things meant, and meaning was never far from the center of Jung's mind. He turned toward medicine, and within medicine, toward psychiatry, a field that was, in the late 19th century, barely a field at all. Psychiatry was the treatment of severe mental illness. It was largely custodial care. Patients were housed, managed, observed. The understanding of what was happening to them, the inner logic of their experiences, the world as they were living it, was mostly absent from the practice. This bothered Jung immediately. He arrived at the Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich in 1900 as a young assistant physician. The Burghölzli was one of the more progressive psychiatric institutions in Europe. Its director, Eugen Bleuler, who would later coin the term schizophrenia, was a serious thinker who believed in actual engagement with patients, in listening rather than simply observing. This was not the norm. Jung fit into this approach naturally. He spent hours with patients. He sat with them. He listened to what they said, not just to classify symptoms, but to understand the experience behind the words. He noticed that what seemed like meaningless speech, what seemed like disorder and chaos, often had a kind of internal logic, that the strange things patients said were not random, that they were, if you listened carefully enough, expressing something, memories, fears, associations, images, that had organized itself around a certain kind of feeling or wound. This was not a popular view. The medical establishment was moving in the other direction, toward biology, toward the idea that mental illness was a disorder of the brain, to be understood at the level of tissue and chemistry. Jung did not dismiss this, but he believed it was not the whole story. He began working on what became known as word association, experiments. He would say a word to a subject and measure how long it took them to respond and what they said. What he found was that certain words produced hesitation, distraction, strange associations, what he called complexes, emotional clusters, organized groups of feelings and memories that had taken on a kind of autonomous life inside the psyche. They interfered with normal thought. They shaped behavior without the person's knowledge or consent. He wasn't the first to suggest something like this. Freud had been writing about the unconscious for years. But Jung was arriving at similar conclusions through his own path, through experiment, through clinical observation, through careful attention to what was happening in actual minds. The unconscious was not a metaphor to him. It was a clinical reality. It was showing up in the hesitations of his subjects, in the delusions of his patients, in the dreams that patients brought him. Strange, vivid, symbol-laden dreams that nobody around him seemed to know what to do with. But that wasn't the real discovery. The real question was what the unconscious actually was. Not just what it did, not just that it influenced behavior, but what it was made of, where it came from, what its nature was. Freud had an answer. Jung was not sure yet whether he agreed. In 1906, Jung sent Freud a copy of his research on word association. Freud wrote back within weeks. The letter was warm, collegial, immediately engaged. Freud had been working in isolation for years. His ideas were largely dismissed or ignored by the mainstream medical world. And here was a serious, credentialed researcher at a respected institution whose experimental work seemed to confirm what Freud had been arguing on theoretical grounds. He recognized in Jung not just an ally, but something rarer, an intellectual equal. They met in person in Vienna in 1907. Jung arrived expecting a meeting. What happened instead was a conversation that lasted 13 hours. There is something almost mythological about that meeting in hindsight. Two men in a room, talking without stopping for most of a day, following the thread of the mind wherever it led. Freud was 50 years old. Jung was 31. Both were serious. Both were ambitious. Both were convinced that the dominant understanding of the human mind was missing something essential. They agreed on the fundamentals. The unconscious was real. It was not simply a place where forgotten things were stored, but an active force that shaped thoughts, feelings, and behavior in ways that consciousness could not see. Dreams were not noise, they were messages. Symptoms were not malfunctions, they were communications from a part of the self that had no other language. Freud was drawn to Jung in ways that went beyond the intellectual. He had disciples, but he wanted an heir, someone who could carry psychoanalysis forward, give it credibility beyond its Jewish Central European origins, establish it in the broader scientific world. Jung was Swiss, Protestant, from a respected institution. He was the perfect figure for that role. Freud began calling him the Crown Prince, the successor, the man who would carry the work forward. Jung was drawn to Freud with something close to the awe he'd never quite managed to feel for his own father. Freud had what Jung's father had lost: conviction, certainty, a framework that held together, the ability to look at the chaos of human suffering and say, "I understand what this is. I can explain this." For several years, they were genuinely close. They traveled together, corresponded constantly, challenged each other's thinking, built on each other's work. Jung was one of the central figures in the early psychoanalytic movement. He was president of the International Psychoanalytic Association. He lectured in America alongside Freud. For a while, it seemed like they were working toward the same thing. But underneath the collaboration, something was not quite right. The problem was not personal, not yet. It was theoretical. And in science, in any serious intellectual project, Theoretical disagreement is not trivial. It goes all the way down. Freud's model of the unconscious was fundamentally about repression, about things that couldn't be faced, desires, fears, memories, being pushed down and stored, and then pushing back up through symptoms and dreams and slips of the tongue. The content was mostly sexual. The driver was mostly biological. The unconscious, for Freud, was a place of personal history, of things the individual had experienced and could not tolerate. Jung found this partial. Not wrong, but not enough. He kept encountering material in his patients, in their dreams, in their delusions, that didn't fit the personal history model. Images and symbols that were too large, too old, too universal to have come from a single person's childhood. Patients who had never studied mythology producing imagery that appeared in ancient myths, symbols that showed up across cultures, across centuries, in people who had no connection to each other. Where was this coming from? He was not ready to say. Not yet. The break hadn't happened, but the question was there, growing louder, every time he read another session transcript. Every time he opened another ancient text and found the same image he'd seen in a patient's dream. What he found next was not expected. It is easy, in retrospect, to describe the split between Jung and Freud as a dramatic rupture. There was no single moment, no shouting match, no definitive scene. It was something slower, a gradual widening of a distance that had always been there, even in the years of closest collaboration. The disagreement that mattered most was about what the unconscious was made of. For Freud, it was almost entirely personal, a reservoir of repressed experience, organized around sexual drives, the libido as the fundamental energy of human life, and neurosis as what happened when that energy was dammed up, redirected, denied. This was a reductive model in the precise sense. It tried to explain the complexity of human inner life by reducing it to its most basic biological drives. The dream about your mother was about your mother. The fear of your father was about your father. The symbols had reference. The reference were personal. Jung could not accept this, not because he thought Freud was wrong about repression or about the role of sexuality in human psychology. He thought Freud was right about all of that as far as it went. The problem was that it didn't go far enough. He had written a long, careful text, Symbols of Transformation, in which he examined the mythology-like imagery that appeared in the mind of a woman who was showing early signs of psychosis. He traced her imagery through comparative mythology, through ancient texts, through religious symbolism. He showed that what was appearing in her mind was not personal. It was collective. It was drawn from a layer of the psyche that was deeper than individual experience. Freud read it before it was published. He understood what it meant. If Jung was right, then the libido was not just sexual energy, and it was something broader, more symbolic, something that flowed into religious experience, into art, into mythology, into the spiritual dimension of human life that Freud wanted to explain away, and Jung wanted to take seriously. The letters between them became formal, then sparse, then stopped. Jung resigned from the presidency of the International Psychoanalytic Association in 1914. By that point, the break was complete. Years later, both men would speak carefully, even bitterly, about what had happened. Freud would describe Jung's departure as a resistance to the core truths of psychoanalysis, as intellectual cowardice. Jung would describe Freud's insistence on sexuality as a kind of dogma, a framework defended more like a religion than a science. They were both right, in their way. They were also both describing something that was never really about the theory. It was about the fact that they had needed different things from each other, and had projected those needs onto the theoretical disagreements. Freud had needed an heir. Jung had needed a father. And when it became clear that what was being offered was not what was being sought, the connection couldn't hold. What remained after the break was not two damaged men. It was two separate intellectual traditions. Psychoanalysis, Freud's tradition, went on to become the dominant clinical framework of the 20th century. Analytical psychology, Jung's tradition, moved in a different direction, toward myth, symbol, religion, the philosophy of the self. Smaller, less clinical, but in some ways more interested in the question that Jung had always cared about most. Not what is wrong with you, but who are you? For Jung, the break was also a kind of liberation. The constraint of working within someone else's framework was gone. He was free to follow the question wherever it led. But what followed the break was not triumph. It was something much darker. And this is where everything changes. Between 1913 and roughly 1917, Carl Jung went somewhere most people don't go. He continued working. He saw patients, he wrote. He maintained the basic external shape of his life. He had a wife, Emma, who would become a respected analyst in her own right. He had children. He had colleagues. But underneath the surface, something had come apart, and he made the unusual decision not to simply try to repair it, but to follow it. He had visions. He would be sitting at his desk or walking in his garden, and images would arrive, vivid, uninvited, often disturbing. An image of Europe covered in blood. Floods. The destruction of civilization. He thought initially that these were symptoms of approaching illness, that he was coming unraveled. But when the First World War began, and Europe did in fact descend into mass slaughter on a scale no one had imagined, something shifted in his understanding. The images had come first. The reality had followed. This did not make him prophetic in any supernatural sense, but it suggested something about the relationship between the deep mind and the world, that the unconscious knew things or felt things that consciousness had not yet caught up with. He began to write in notebooks, to draw, to paint, to record the imagery with the same kind of careful attention he had always given to his patients' material. This became, after his death, when it was finally published, the Red Book. A vast, strange, beautifully illustrated record of a man's journey into the interior of his own mind. The Red Book is not a theoretical text. It is not a clinical document. It is something much harder to categorize. Part journal, part artwork, part mythology. In it, Jung records conversations with figures that appeared in his imagination. Not hallucinations exactly, not delusions. He knew they were products of his own mind, but he treated them as real interlocutors. He asked them questions. He listened to their answers. He pushed back. He argued. One of these figures he called Elijah, who became Philemon, a wise old man with kingfisher wings and bull's horns who seemed to know things Jung didn't know. Jung was disturbed by this. If Philemon was a product of his own imagination, why did Philemon say things that surprised him? Why did the figure possess a kind of knowledge that felt separate from Jung's own? The answer he arrived at, slowly over years of this work, was that the unconscious was not simply a repository of personal experience. It was more like a personality in itself, a presence, not autonomous in the way another person is autonomous, but not merely controlled by the conscious mind either. It had its own dynamics, its own images, its own agenda. This was not a comfortable conclusion, but he kept going. The method he was developing, of engaging consciously and deliberately with the imagery that arose from the unconscious, of entering into dialogue with it, became what he called active imagination. It was not passive daydreaming, not surrender. It was engagement. The ego, the conscious self, remained present, observant, questioning. But it allowed the unconscious to speak and then responded, and the exchange between them was where something new could emerge. He would later describe this period as dangerous. He was not dramatizing. There were moments when the pull inward was so strong that he was not certain he could come back. He developed disciplines to stay anchored. He worked with his hands, building walls and towers at his house in Bollingen. He maintained his clinical work. He stayed close to ordinary physical reality because he needed it as ballast while he moved in deeper directions. His family worried. Some colleagues thought he was having a breakdown. There was probably something to that. But there was also something deliberate about it. A man making a choice to not look away. To not medicate the discomfort into silence. To stay with the dissolution long enough to see what was on the other side. What he found, on the other side, was the architecture of the unconscious. Not a chaos, a structure. A layered, organized, symbol-rich structure with its own laws and its own intelligence. Not personal, or not only personal, something larger. Something that connected him, through the imagery he was encountering, to human beings across all of history and all of culture. He emerged from those years with the raw material of everything he would spend the rest of his life articulating. There is a part of you that you've spent your life pretending doesn't exist. Not a small part. Not a trivial corner of your personality that you occasionally hide from people you want to impress. Something more substantial than that. A whole dimension of who you are, impulses, feelings, desires, parts of your history, that you have quietly, continuously, often without realizing it, moved into the dark. Jung called this the shadow. The concept sounds simple. In some ways it is, but the implications of it go further than most people are willing to follow. The shadow begins forming in childhood, when we first learn that certain parts of ourselves are not acceptable. This process is not malicious. It's social. We learn what gets approval and what doesn't. We learn what makes the people we depend on comfortable and what frightens them or disgusts them or makes them pull away. And because we need those people, because we need safety and connection and warmth, we begin, slowly, to split. We keep the acceptable parts visible. We perform them. We build an identity around them. Jung called this the persona, the mask we wear for the social world. The professional, the parent, the good person, the responsible one. The persona is not false, exactly, but it is selective. It is the version of ourselves that we've decided to present. What doesn't fit the persona gets pushed inward. Anger that seemed too dangerous, desire that seemed too shameful, grief that seemed too indulgent. The capacity for cruelty that you felt once and never wanted to feel again. The neediness you couldn't afford. The fear that felt too humiliating to admit. All of that goes into the shadow. And the shadow does not disappear. It waits. It surfaces in moments of stress, when the persona cracks and something else comes through. It shows up in dreams, often in the form of a threatening or repulsive figure. A dark stranger, a monster, an enemy. That, if you look carefully, bears some resemblance to yourself. It appears in the people who irritate you most intensely. because what we find intolerable in others is often what we cannot stand to find in ourselves. When someone else's arrogance fills you with disproportionate rage, it is worth asking, where is the arrogance in you that you've never looked at? This is the mechanism Jung called projection. We see in others what we cannot see in ourselves. We make someone else the container for the feelings we've refused to own. The problem is not moral exactly. Shadow work is not about becoming a better person in some simple behavioral sense. It's about becoming a more complete one. Because what you have put in the shadow has not been destroyed. It has only been cut off from your awareness. It continues to exist. It continues to have energy. And energy that isn't acknowledged doesn't sit still. It finds ways to move. The man who has never allowed himself to feel his own rage becomes a man who is quietly controlling, whose anger seeps out in forms no one can quite name. The woman who has never allowed herself to want things, who has defined herself by giving, finds, in middle age, a hollowness she can't explain. The person who has constructed an identity entirely around goodness carries a shadow full of darkness that will demand to be reckoned with, one way or another. Jung was clear. Integrating the shadow does not mean becoming what you've suppressed. It doesn't mean letting the rage out or giving every dark impulse free rein. It means becoming conscious of it. It means seeing it. Because the moment you can see it, really see it, with some degree of honesty, it loses its autonomy. It stops running you without your knowledge. He made this point personally as well. He was not describing a problem in other people. He knew his own shadow. He spent years in the Red Book in direct confrontation with it. He was a difficult man in some ways, capable of cruelty, of infidelity, of intellectual arrogance, of a self-importance he was not always able to check. He did not write about the shadow as someone who had conquered his. He wrote about it as someone who had learned to see his. There is a difference. And there is something quietly important in that distinction. Jung was not offering a cure. He was offering something more modest and perhaps more honest, the possibility of awareness. The possibility that the parts of yourself you've never looked at can be looked at, and that the looking itself is worth something. The shadow is not your enemy. It is the part of you that has never been given a fair hearing. At this point, a reasonable person might ask, if the shadow is personal, if it's made up of things I specifically have suppressed, where do all those ancient symbols come from? Why does a patient who has never read Greek mythology dream in the imagery of Greek mythology? Why do the same symbols, the great mother, the hero, the trickster, the wise old man, appear in cultures that had no contact with each other? Why do the deepest layers of dream life seem to draw from a vocabulary that is older than any individual? This is the question that drove Jung to his most original and most controversial idea. He called it the collective unconscious. The shadow is personal. It's made of your particular history. But beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the layer of repressed experience and forgotten memory, Jung believed there was another layer, a layer that was not personal at all, a layer that was shared. That was, in some sense, the inheritance of the species. He was not arguing for a mystical connection between people. He was not saying that human minds are linked in some supernatural way, sending signals through some invisible medium. He was arguing for something more like biological structure. Just as we are born with a nervous system that predisposes us to certain kinds of perception, to seeing in color, to hearing in certain frequencies, to organizing experience in time and space. He believed we are born with a psychic structure that predisposes us to certain kinds of experience. We are primed to respond to certain images, certain stories, certain patterns. We don't learn them from culture. We bring them with us. And the cultures we build, the myths, the religions, the fairy tales, the art, are, in part, the collective working out of these deep-set patterns. He called these patterns archetypes. The archetypes are not images exactly. They are more like templates, predispositions toward certain kinds of image. The Great Mother is not a specific mother in any specific culture. She is the template that generates all the specific mothers, the nurturing one and the devouring one, Mary and Medusa, the goddess who gives life and the goddess who takes it. When a culture produces an image of the divine feminine, it is filling in a template that was already there. The hero is not Odysseus, or Gilgamesh, or Beowulf, or Luke Skywalker. The hero is the underlying pattern that all of these stories are expressing. The individual who separates from safety faces a great danger, descends into darkness, and returns transformed. Every culture produces this story. Every culture had to produce it, because the archetype was there, waiting to be expressed. The shadow, again, is an archetype. Not just your personal darkness, but the universal human experience of having a hidden self, of carrying a dark double. The self is an archetype, the potential for wholeness, for the integration of all parts of the psyche that every individual carries but few fully realize. Jung did not believe the archetypes were accessible to direct inspection. You couldn't look at them the way you could look at a thought. You could only see their expressions, the images they generated, the emotions they evoked, the stories they powered. He spent decades tracing these expressions across cultures, across centuries, in alchemy and mythology and religion and dream. He was criticized for this, and some of the criticism was fair. The collective unconscious is not verifiable in the way a scientific hypothesis should be verifiable. You cannot run an experiment that confirms or disconfirms it. It is an inference, a large organizing inference, based on a pattern of observation that could in principle be explained in other ways. But the pattern he was pointing at was real, even if his explanation for it was disputed. The cross-cultural recurrence of certain images and stories is not invented. It is not a coincidence. Something is generating it. Whether you call that something the collective unconscious, or evolutionary psychology, or the deep structure of human cognition. Something underlies the remarkable similarity of the stories human beings have always told about themselves. Jung chose to take this seriously rather than explain it away. That choice led him to some of the most original thinking in 20th century psychology, and to some of the most speculative. Both are part of his legacy. The mind does not speak in sentences. That is the thing that takes a long time to accept, and that Jung understood earlier and more deeply than almost anyone else in modern psychology. The rational, verbal, sequential mind, the one composing this paragraph, the one reading it, is only one part of the story. Underneath it, organized by different rules, running on different logic, is a mind that communicates in images. Dreams are the clearest evidence. Every night, the sleeping mind generates imagery of a density and strangeness that the waking mind almost never produces. Objects transform. Impossible things happen calmly. People are both themselves and someone else. A house becomes a body. A journey through a dark wood becomes a crisis of identity. The imagery is not random. It is organized around feeling, around association, around what Jung called the symbol, an image that carries more meaning than can be stated directly. This is not the same as a sign. A sign points to something specific and known. A red traffic light means stop. There is nothing more to say. A symbol points toward something larger than itself, something that cannot be fully articulated, only approached. The cross is not just a torture device. The circle is not just a shape. The mother in your dream is not only your mother. Jung was deeply suspicious of interpretation that reduced symbols to signs. The standard psychoanalytic approach, as he understood it, was to decode the symbol, to find what it really meant in terms of the patient's personal history, and then to dissolve it. The snake in the dream meant the father's authority. The house meant the body. The work was to translate it back into ordinary language. Jung resisted this. He believed the symbol was valuable precisely because it could not be fully translated. It was carrying something that ordinary language couldn't hold. The goal was not to decode it, but to sit with it, to let it speak in its own terms, to follow where it led, to allow the symbol to do what only a symbol can do. Open a dimension of experience that rational language closes off. This is why mythology mattered so much to him. Mythology is not children's literature. It is not naive, pre-scientific explanation. It is the accumulated symbolic language of entire civilizations, a record in story form of how people have tried to express truths about the human condition that resist direct statement. The story of Orpheus descending into the underworld to find what he has lost is not about a musician with an unusual talent. It is about what it feels like to pursue something precious into darkness, about how the act of looking back, of not trusting, of needing to see, can be its own form of destruction. You could state that theme directly, but stating it directly is not the same as experiencing it through the story. The symbol, the image, does something to you that the concept alone cannot. Jung developed his method of dream interpretation around this understanding. He did not have a fixed key, a dictionary of symbols with settled meanings. He believed each symbol had to be understood in the context of the specific dreamer's life, the specific moment in that life, the associations that the symbol evoked for that person. He worked with what he called amplification, taking an image from a dream and expanding it, connecting it to parallel images in mythology, in fairy tale, in alchemy, in world religion, until the image became rich with resonance rather than collapsed into a single meaning. The mind, in this view, is not trying to tell you something simple in an unnecessarily complicated way. It is trying to tell you something complicated in the only way it knows, through image, through story, through the charged and layered language of symbol. And if you can learn to read that language, not decode it, but read it, you gain access to a kind of intelligence that rational thought cannot provide, not better than rational thought, different from it, operating on different material, answering different questions. The question rational thought answers: what is this? What caused it? What should I do? The question the symbolic mind answers: what does this mean? What does it ask of me? What am I underneath? What does it mean to become yourself? Not to become successful, not to become happy in the ordinary sense, not to achieve the things you were told to achieve, or to turn into the version of yourself that would make other people most comfortable, but to actually become yourself, the full, complicated, contradictory, unresolved, deeply particular person that you are. Jung called this process individuation, and it was, for him, the central task of a human life. The word needs to be handled carefully because it is easily misunderstood. Individuation sounds like individualism, the celebration of the autonomous self, the rejection of community in favor of personal freedom. It is not that. Individuation does not mean becoming more isolated, more detached, more purely your own person in the modern self-help sense. It means becoming more whole. What are the parts that need to be integrated? The shadow. All the parts of yourself that have been exiled from your conscious identity. The anima or animus, the inner image of the opposite sex that lives in the unconscious of every person, and which carries qualities of feeling or logos that the conscious personality has undervalued. The archetypes, which arise in their season and require a response. And the self, the organizing center of the psyche that is larger than the ego, that holds the possibility of what you could be if all of these parts were in conversation rather than at war. The ego, the conscious I, is not the self. This was one of Jung's most important distinctions, and one of the most counterintuitive. We tend to experience the ego as the self, as the totality of who we are. I think, therefore I am. The ego is the subject of experience. But for Jung, the ego was more like the executive of a very large organization who has mistaken himself for the organization itself. The psyche is larger than the ego. It has dimensions the ego cannot see. And the health of the person depends on the ego's willingness to eventually acknowledge this, to become less the center and more the mediator between the conscious world and the much larger unconscious one. Individuation is often triggered by crisis. Midlife was the phase Jung associated with it most strongly, not because the midlife crisis is a cliché, but because it genuinely tends to be the moment when the structures you built in the first half of life, the career, the identity, the persona, stop feeling like enough. The ambitions that drove you in your 20s have either been achieved and found wanting, or failed to materialize and are now being mourned. Either way, there is a gap, a question, a restlessness that the ordinary answers don't satisfy. For Jung, this was not a pathology to be managed. It was a summons. The second half of life was not meant to be a continuation of the first. It was meant to be a different kind of project, inward rather than outward, less about acquisition and more about integration. Less about building the persona and more about honest confrontation with everything the persona has left out. He was drawing, here, on something he'd observed in himself after the break with Freud. That dissolution, that breakdown of the framework he'd built, had been terrible. But it had also cleared ground. It had forced him inward in a way that nothing external could have forced. And the encounter with his own unconscious, with his shadow, with his anima, with the archetypes that arose in his visions and his dreams, had produced not a new persona, but something he experienced as more genuinely himself, more whole. Individuation is not a destination. It is not something you complete. It is a lifelong process of paying attention to what is being excluded from your sense of yourself, and finding ways to bring it into relationship with the rest. The goal is not perfection. It is not the elimination of conflict or difficulty. The goal is integration, the tension between the opposites, between what you present and what you carry, between the conscious and the unconscious, between the individual and the collective. That tension is not the problem. It is the life. Carl Jung is one of the most cited and least read figures in modern culture. His ideas have entered the language in ways that would have puzzled him. The introvert and extrovert distinction, which he developed as part of a careful typological theory, has become a simplistic binary that people use to explain their social preferences. The shadow self appears in internet psychology as a neat package of repressed feelings that you can resolve in a weekend workshop. The archetypes show up in marketing frameworks and personality quizzes. The collective unconscious has been annexed by everyone from New Age spirituality to evolutionary psychology to pop neuroscience. None of these appropriations are quite wrong, but none of them are quite right either. And the result is a legacy that is simultaneously ubiquitous and poorly understood. The introvert/extrovert distinction in Jung's original formulation was not about how much you like parties. It was about the fundamental orientation of psychic energy, whether a person's primary reference point was the inner world or the outer world, the subjective or the objective. This was one piece of a more complex typology that included thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition as the four fundamental psychological functions. The full theory was an attempt to map the different ways people engage with reality. It has been flattened into a quiz you can take online in 3 minutes. The idea of archetypes has been perhaps most dramatically oversimplified. The hero, the mentor, the trickster. These have become storytelling frameworks, personality categories, marketing personas. They are not wrong as practical tools, but they miss the depth of what Jung was trying to describe. The archetypes for Jung were not personality types. They were eruptions of the collective unconscious into individual experience, dynamically powerful, emotionally charged, potentially dangerous if engaged with unconsciously. The hero is not a character type. It is a force that can consume a person who identifies with it completely, which is why mythology is full of heroes who are destroyed by their own heroism. He was also, and importantly, misread on the question of religion and the supernatural. Jung wrote extensively about religious experience, about God and the divine, about mystical states. He was careful, sometimes agonizingly careful, to insist that he was speaking as a psychologist, not as a theologian. He was not making claims about whether God exists. He was making claims about the psychological reality of the experience of God, about the fact that something that functioned like a divine encounter was real in its effects, whatever its ultimate nature. This distinction was lost on many readers, who have either recruited him as a spiritual authority or dismissed him as a mystic who should not be taken seriously as a scientist. The criticism from the scientific side has been real and not entirely unfair. The collective unconscious cannot be tested in the way scientific hypotheses should be tested. The archetypes, as he defined them, are not operationalizable. His method of amplification in dream interpretation is not replicable in any controlled sense. Academic psychology, which spent much of the 20th century trying to establish itself as a rigorous empirical science, largely left Jung behind. Not because his observations were wrong, but because his framework was not amenable to experimental confirmation. This is a genuine limitation. But it is worth holding alongside a different question. What kind of phenomena are we talking about, and what kind of inquiry do they require? Jung's subject matter, the deep structure of the psyche, the symbolic life of human beings, the meaning of dreams, the experience of the numinous, may not be well served by the methods that work for measuring cortisol levels or response times. This does not make it unreal. It makes it difficult to study scientifically. And the difficulty of studying something scientifically is not the same as the thing not existing. He was a complicated figure, and the complications are part of what he was pointing at. He was not offering certainty. He was offering a way of looking, a more careful, more humble, more symbolic way of paying attention to the depths of human experience. Whether that way of looking is scientific in the strict sense may be less important than whether it illuminates something true. By the time Jung reached his 60s and 70s, he had become something that he had never set out to be. A figure, an institution, a man whose name people invoked with reverence or dismissal, without necessarily having read him. He was, by this point, living primarily at Bollingen, the stone tower on the edge of Lake Zurich that he had begun building decades earlier, adding to it piece by piece over the years, the way a person adds to their inner life. There was no electricity there for many years, no running water. He cooked over a fire, drew water from a well, worked with his hands. He carved stone. He painted. He built. He was not retreating from the world. He was maintaining access to a part of himself that required silence, that required distance from the noise of professional life and public reputation. He had always needed both, the engaged world and the deep interior. And at Bollingen, the interior had priority. He continued writing. The later work is some of his most ambitious and some of his most difficult. Psychology and alchemy explored the imagery of medieval alchemical texts as a kind of projected psychology. The alchemist, trying to transform base metal into gold, was also describing a transformation of the self that they had no direct language for. Aeon traced the symbolism of the Christian Aeon, the age of Pisces, as he understood it, through the history of Western religious and psychological development. Answer to Job was one of his most provocative texts, an extended, personal, at times angry engagement with the biblical figure of Job and the image of God that the story implies. He traveled. He visited North America, Africa, New Mexico, where his encounters with Pueblo Native American culture affected him deeply. He had a conversation with a Pueblo man named Mountain Lake that he returned to often in his writing. Mountain Lake told him that white people seemed tense and restless, that they seemed to think with their heads rather than their hearts. Jung took this seriously in a way that was not simply romantic. He heard it as an observation about something missing in the dominant Western psychological mode, a disconnection from something larger, a narrowing of experience that was costing more than it appeared to. His wife, Emma, died in 1955. They had been together for over 50 years. Their relationship had been complicated. Jung had maintained a long and close relationship with Tony Wolfe, a former patient and colleague who became central to both his personal and intellectual life. Emma had lived with this and had done her own serious analytical work, becoming a significant figure in the development of Jungian psychology. The loss, when it came, was enormous. He was working, in his final years, on what would become Man and His Symbols, a project meant to make his ideas accessible to a general audience. He died in 1961, before it was fully complete. He was 85 years old. He had outlived Freud by more than 2 decades. He had outlived most of the colleagues who had formed his world. He had lived long enough to see his ideas enter the culture and be misrepresented there, long enough to see the beginning of the legacy he was leaving, long enough to know that the work was incomplete, not because he had failed, but because the subject would always outrun the understanding. He had said, near the end of his life, in one of his final interviews, that he did not know whether he believed in God. What he knew, what he could not deny, was that he had had experiences that had the quality of the sacred, that something had met him in the depths, that the unconscious was not empty. He did not try to make this more precise than that. He had spent a life being precise, and he knew the limits of precision. Some things could only be approached, never finally captured. We have traveled a long way. From a child in a village by a Swiss lake, lying in the dark with a dream he couldn't explain. Through the hospital corridors where patients said things that seemed like madness and were actually something else. Through the years of friendship and rupture. Through the descent into the interior. Through the long, slow labor of articulating what had been found there. And what was found, finally? Not a cure, not a method, not a self-help framework, though the ideas have been packaged as one many times. Something more modest and more radical than any of those things. An invitation to look. If you are willing to sit with this for a moment, really sit with it. Not just as an idea about someone else, but as something that might be true of your own experience. There are some things worth considering. You have a shadow, not a metaphor, a dimension of yourself that contains everything you've decided is not you. The anger you don't claim, the need you don't acknowledge, the impulses you've filed away as belonging to worse people than yourself. That part of you is still there. It still has energy. And it is having more influence on your life than you realize, precisely because you are not looking at it. You carry patterns you did not choose. Stories that were running before you arrived. The archetypes are not abstractions. They are the plots your life keeps defaulting to. The characters who keep appearing in different costumes. The myths you are living without knowing you are living them. Becoming conscious of the pattern does not break it automatically, but it changes your relationship to it. You become, at least partly, the author rather than only the character. And there is in you something that is trying to become whole, not perfect, not resolved, whole. Something that wants the excluded parts brought back into relationship with the rest. Something that is not satisfied with a half-life, with the persona without the shadow, with the thinking without the feeling, with the achievement without the meaning. This drive toward wholeness is not comfortable. It tends to express itself through exactly the crises and the losses and the discontents that we spend our lives trying to avoid. Midlife, failure, the discovery that what you built your identity around is not enough. These are not accidents. They are, in Jung's understanding, the psyche's way of insisting that something has been left out, that the project of becoming yourself is not finished. He was not optimistic in a simple sense. He did not think this was easy, or that most people would do it, or that the doing of it would make life comfortable. He thought it was the task that mattered. The alternative, a life lived entirely on the surface, organized around comfort and performance and the approval of others, running on patterns you've never examined, was, in his view, a kind of sleepwalking. He had seen what happened to people who sleepwalked through their own lives. He had seen what happened to whole cultures when the shadow remained unconscious, when the denied and excluded parts found no legitimate expression and so found illegitimate ones. He lived through 2 world wars. He had a clear-eyed, sometimes grim view of what happens when human beings do not do the difficult work of knowing themselves. If this made you think differently, subscribing helps you find more like this. The last thing to be said about Carl Jung is not about his theories. It is about a quality of attention. He paid attention to the wrong things, according to the dominant scientific culture of his era. He paid attention to dreams, to symbols, to the strange and the numinous, to the experiences that don't fit the categories. He took seriously what most serious people dismissed. and he took it seriously not because he was credulous or romantic or anti-scientific, but because he believed that the most important things about human experience were happening in exactly the territory that the official maps left blank. He was difficult. He was contradictory. He held ideas that remain genuinely disputed, and he sometimes held them with more confidence than the evidence warranted. He was human in all the complicated ways, capable of great insight and considerable self-deception, of rigorous thought and reaching speculation. But his central question, what is the mind really at its depth, and what does that depth ask of us, is not a question that has been answered. It may be a question that cannot be answered, only approached. And the approaching, the willingness to keep walking toward the depths rather than organizing your life around the comfortable surface. That is what he spent 85 years modeling. He mapped a territory that is not finished being explored. It is the territory inside you. Jung didn't solve the mind. He showed that it is deeper than we think.